Welcome back, friends, to the second half of today's economic update. We're talking about reform and revolution. We've given the examples of slavery and the Great Depression. Now let's take a look at the last 75 years since the Great Depression was over. The most important economic reality of the last 75 years here in the United States has been the undoing of the reforms carried out by Franklin Roosevelt under the pressure of the socialist, communist, and labor movements of the United States. That's been our number one economic reality. The business community had been horrified by those reforms. Because remember, who paid for Social Security, unemployment compensation, who had to pay the minimum wage that was established, and who had to fund paying all those people getting government jobs? The answer, the business community. The wealthy people of America and the corporations that make them wealthy, the top 10% that own 80% of the shares, they were taxed heavily, and they had to lend money to the government, whatever money they didn't get lost by taxation. So they were doubly angry. All of this effort by the government to help the mass of people at their expense. So they went to work to undo the New Deal. They stopped government hiring of those millions of people, got rid of that. They nibbled away at unemployment compensation. They nibbled away at Social Security. From being a basic way people could live, it's now a support, but only poor people actually live only on Social Security. It's too small, so they've cut back. And forget about the minimum wage. The last time that was raised was in 2009. Even though we've had rising prices every year since, nothing has been raised in the minimum wage. We have behaved as a society savagely towards the poor people who depend on the minimum wage. So we have undone the New Deal of the Great Depression. It turned out that the corporations who had to pay for it and the rich people who had to pay for it got together and went to work to undo the reforms. And they have largely succeeded. That's what the Republican Party's number one priority has always been. Change the tax laws, change the inheritance laws, do everything necessary for corporations and the rich to re-establish their absolutely dominant position relative to a mass of people who have economic problems all the time. Yep, we're back to where we were before the Great Depression hit, and all the statistics show it. And there's a lesson for us here. Reformers are the people who want to make a system work better for average people. They do. They're sincere. They mean it. But they don't want to take the step that might guarantee it. Let me go back to the slave example. Giving the slaves rules, establishing laws in slaves' societies. You must feed, clothe, shelter, and so forth. In these minimally decent ways, it's like the reforms of the Great Depression. They can be taken away if you leave the master-slave relationship, because the master has every incentive to undo the reforms that strugglers were able to squeeze out of them in the first place. The employers of the Great Depression had every incentive, namely their profits, to undo the taxes they had to pay, the money they had to lend to the government, and so on. They didn't want this. They wanted the government to work for them, and they didn't want to have to pay for it. And so they undid the reforms. Okay, now we come to our situation here and now. The United States succeeded in the aftermath of the Great Depression in ruling out revolution. Revolution was associated with the evil Soviet Empire. The government was very bad. The government was intrusive. The government was dictatorial. All ways to suggest don't go anywhere near where those revolutionaries are. So all that the Republicans and Democrats debate are reforms. Each of them has some reforms they want and some reforms they don't, but the unspoken agreement between them is never to suggest anything that might look, smell, taste, or seem to be revolutionary. The state must be kept out. Some of you have a whole philosophy of that called libertarianism. The state is bad. The state is evil. The state grabs power. The state. Where does that come from? It comes from that split between reform and revolution that came into being around the time of the Great Depression and has been fought ever since, mostly by people who either don't want any change, the so-called conservatives, or many of the reformers who want to keep everything within the realm of reform because they're terribly afraid of the revolution. And we have problems now that are producing the same result. Let's go back to that minimum wage story. It's $7.25, the federal minimum wage. That's outrageous in terms of what it is you can't afford if you work 40 hours a week and get $7.25 paid per hour. It's so gross that reformers in about 30 states have raised the minimum wage in their state, which they can do way above the minimum. Last time I looked, if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of cities and towns and states who have a minimum wage around $15 or more. That's more than double the federal. That reformers were able in those states to get the wages raised. That's like people who didn't like slavery because it didn't feed slaves properly were successful to sometimes get the slaves to be fed better. And you have that here now, too. We don't dare even talk about the reform that they did in the 1930s with the government hiring people who don't get a job in the private sector. That's a way of solving the unemployment problem. We have millions of Americans unemployed right now. The private sector has no work for them. They have no job. Does the government come in and give them a job the way the reformers did in the 1930s? Not at all. Lets them sit out there. Wow. We only discuss reforms, and half of them we don't do. But what would revolution be now? Would it be the government coming in? Well, the answer is no, because what reform and revolution mean, that changes too. Reform, what it means, changes, but so does revolution. One of the things that was learned in the 1930s was precisely that even if you bring the state in, which Roosevelt did, as an employer, as a regulator, as a pension provider, as a minimum wage guarantor, even if you give the state a big role, if that's all you do, then the rich and the powerful remain the employers who gather the profits into their hands. They can, and our history proves that they will, undo the reforms. The lesson of the Great Depression and everything since has been that we shouldn't have gotten caught up in the reform versus revolution because they shouldn't be seen as either or. They should be seen as reform and revolution. Why? Because the only way to secure reforms is by revolution. It turns out that the way the reformers got slavery to treat the slaves better was by ending slavery. The only way to solve the problems of unemployment and poverty and all the other basic economic issues confronting the United States, which are now building to a crescendo as a desperate government. That's what Mr. Trump's regime represents. A desperate government reaches out and tries unorthodox things, tariffs, firing hundreds of thousands of public employees. These are extreme actions, and they reflect the extremity of the dangers and the crises that have accumulated. They're acts of desperation. However cleverly they are choreographed in front of your evening television news, that's what they are. They are attempts to reform. Mr. Trump's tariffs want to reform the entire global trading system. With Mr. Musk, he wants to reform the entire federal workforce, what it does, how it does it, who does it. These are dramatic reforms. But what you'll never hear from the Republicans is one word about changing the capitalist system. And by that I mean, very simply, the arrangement in which, in every factory, store, or office, a very small group of people, the board of directors if it's a corporation, the owner, the operator of the business, the partnership if that's what it is, they make all the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And of course, should surprise no one, they take care of themselves first. They're rich, you're not. They're powerful, you're not. They hire and fire, you don't. That's the difference. And the Republicans wouldn't say a word. But because of what happened after the Great Depression, the Democrats won't say a word about that either. During the last presidential election, neither Mr. Trump, nor Mr. Biden, nor Ms. Harris had one word to say about the employer-employee relationship and the imbalance of power and wealth inside every business that shows us. You want there not to be an abuse of the mass of working people, then you're going to have to face it. They're going to have to be in charge. If you don't want masters to abuse slaves, you've got to end slavery. If you don't want employers to abuse employees, you've got to end that relationship. You've got to make the enterprise a collective, democratically owned and operated institution. Then, when the people run it together, they're not going to give one guy $400 billion and everybody else wonders how they can pay for their kids' college education, right? Those kinds of results plunge us back into what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about, reform or revolution. But in the 100 years since Rosa wrote, and we learned so much from her, one of the deepest lessons is to not get caught again in the either or. You need a revolution because it's the only way to secure the reforms that people are willing to talk about, but are so afraid of seeing the relationship of the reforms they seek to the revolution they are so afraid of even thinking or talking about, let alone making happen. Thank you for your attention, and as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.